Greetings, everyone. First, let me just congratulate the women's team. Terrific job. It's always so exciting. Basketball is our is really one of our biggest sports going back to when I was at school. So, obviously, we don't have a football program. Basketball's just always been a big thing. So, congratulations to the Cougars. I hope you were all there. My understanding is that the first, I don't know, 100 of you or something through the door got a free t-shirt. Always take advantage of the free t-shirt. That being said, here we are. The other two videos are up. They are just over an hour and a half in total. So I am going to wrap things up here with a half an hour talking about contemporary events. Because just like China, where I tried to uh, sort of fill in for you what the situation is as far as the murkiness of a successor for Xi Jinping down the road, what's at stake in the territorial disputes in the South and East China Sea, in terms of how those tie into your own lives, in terms of the fact that Washington has security relationships with Japan and the Philippines and has committed the United States to fight in defense of territorial claims made by those states in the South and East China Sea. So let's talk about some of the things that in terms of politics today with Russia that are going to be more maybe germane to yourself and to your understanding of what's going on. And I'm going to start here by reading a passage from 265, and it comes from your phenomenal book, Roskin's book here. And I had said to you, look, Roskin does his best. He's a career foreign service officer, and he's just a bit of a Russophobe, right? He's an older fellow. He just died a couple of years ago, so he served during the Cold War for many years, and then he taught, at like American University and the U.S. Army War College and things like that. So very, just kind of natural for him. But so I thought this passage was particularly interesting here. Remember that this particular updated edition came out 2016, 2017. So, I'm going to read something to you. Geography, Putin and geopolitics. Russians are unhappy and fearful because their former Central and Eastern European satellites, such as Poland, the Czech Republic, and Hungary, joined NATO in 1999, and the former Soviet republics of Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia joined NATO in 2004, along with Bulgaria, Romania, Slovakia, and Slovenia. NATO, Cold War enemy, has taken over Russia's former security belt. No Russian likes this, and Putin therefore tries to counter it. Putin, in many respects, is something of a czarist figure, practicing the Kremlin's traditional geopolitics. Territory, in this view, equals security. Starting under the czars, but re-emphasized by Stalin, became an article of Kremlin faith that Russia needed a defensive belt against invasions by Teutonic Knights, Swedes, Napoleon, Imperial Germany, and Nazi Germany. After World War II, Moscow organized Eastern Europe as the Warsaw Pact, a shield against NATO. To keep the shield, Khrushchev crushed the 1956 Hungarian uprising, and Brezhnev crushed the 1968 Prague Spring. Both nearly invaded Poland. But East Europe was an economic and military drain on the Soviet Union and blocked improved relations with the West. By 1989, Gorbachev had decided to no longer support the communist regimes of East Europe. They fell. In a few years, all these lands joined NATO. Some critics say NATO's eastward expansion caused Russian hostility, for the Kremlin was bound to take it as a threat. When Georgia and Ukraine moved to join NATO, Putin stopped them, and most Russians, in fear of invasion from the West, cheered. We, Roskin meaning himself and fellow policymakers, must ask whether Putin's policy was a reasonable defensive move or an exaggerated aggressive move. End quote. So, There's a number of books you can read about this. Whenever I'm talking about this particular subject, I try not to choose a revisionist text. I try to choose a text that gives the state line, an establishment historian who just admits that when uh, the Soviet Union was withdrawing from the former East Bloc countries, there was no agreement on paper about where NATO's forces really were going to go. But the spirit of the agreement, which is admitted, Sarot is the most recent scholar who, again, I mean, I believe she's a fellow on the Council of Foreign Relations, a member of the Council of Foreign Relations. She teaches at Georgetown, if I remember correctly. So very establishment, very mainstream. Says, look, the spirit of the understanding was that yes, NATO was not going to move eastward. Um, this is ignored later by the Clinton administration for a variety of reasons. It was opposed by many foreign policy people in Washington as a bad idea, as unnecessary, as likely to undermine the moderate reformers in Russia who had taken apart the Soviet structure, who had brought an end to the Soviet system, because it was going to empower hardliners and nationalists who, would basically depict them as soft in the face of an advancing threat. Um, and every virtually every Russian leader opposed it. In fact, Burns, who was the God, what was he was the ambassador at the time, but he went on to play significant roles in the Bush and Obama and Biden administrations, and he basically wrote policy memos and things coming back saying, look, this is wildly unpopular here in Russia, NATO expansion. It's understandable why a country like Poland, I think I've mentioned to you my talks with Polish nationals that I've met on my travels who say, huh, we love NATO. We're right in between Russia and Germany. Of course we love NATO. There was just something in the news today about the Polish president saying, "Hey, we would love to have some U.S. troops in Poland." Well, of course they would. Of course they would. Um, and Bill Clinton was chasing Polish votes in the Midwest, and he was chasing Lockheed dollars, just like everyone in Congress was. There was a lobby called the Lobby to Expand NATO, which was headed by one of Lockheed Martin's vice presidents. And the whole plan was if you bring these countries into NATO, then they buy American military equipment, Lockheed jets. They later changed the name on the committee, the committee, the committee for NATO. I forget what they changed the name to, but originally it was the Committee to Expand NATO, but um, brought to you by the same people who created the Committee to Invade Iraq. But um, I think it's very interesting. One of the most interesting ones is George Kennan opposed it. This was the guy who came up with the policy of containment of the Soviet Union. One of the original Cold Warriors said in a very famous interview with Friedman, actually, from the New York Times. If you read the New York Times, I got a couple of his books somewhere on the shelves in here. Too many books in here. Saying, look, this is gonna provoke a reaction. There's no danger, nothing's gonna happen. Europe is gonna be united and whole and solid, and Russia is, on the decline. Its population is declining, its economy is, a mess. It's not gonna be any threat to Europe. Um, but what could, empower hardliners and militarists in Russia is if NATO starts encircling Russia, moving right up to Russia's borders. And then there will be a reaction by Russia. And then all of the people who said that we should do NATO expansion in the Clinton administration, like Lake and Talbot, will say, see, we told you that's just how the Russians are. And he says, but this is just false. This is just false. You're creating a self-fulfilling prophecy. And as he says here in the book, uh, as I was just reading here, yes, the initial admission, right? The initial admission here um, was of Poland, the Czech Republic, and Hungary. Yeltsin opposes this and just asks the Clinton administration, please hold off until the election is over. He, objects. Can't really do anything about it. Russia's a complete mess at this time. In 2004, there's the Big Bang expansion. Putin is president by this time. He's trying to form kind of a partnership against terrorism with the United States. When the towers were hit on 9/11, the first call that George W. Bush got was from Putin, who had been dealing, of course, with his own Islamic terrorism problem in the country related to the Caucasus, which I had mentioned. But there were some really horrifying attacks. I remember them on the news being a kid. And he opened up air bases and things like that for for use by NATO troops who were going to be in Afghanistan and then later in Iraq. And that was a move that was opposed by a lot of military hardliners. Putin was not Vladimir Putin yet. He was in his first term at that point. It was a huge political risk, and the Bush administration wound up ripping up some arms deals, some arms treaties that were limiting things like missiles and golly, it's just in retrospect, looking back and seeing the way relations have deteriorated is very sad because as you can see here, um, I'm going to share this with you really quick. Um, right here, the issues in contemporary managing relations with the United States. Of course, right now, the Trump administration is talking with the Russians about ending the war because right here, when Georgia and Ukraine moved to join NATO, so 2004, the Big Bang, Latvia, Lithuania, Estonia, they joined NATO. Uh, Putin really doesn't say a whole lot about it. In 2007, though, in 2007, the Bush administration, and I've been talking about the George W. Bush administration, uh, essentially says we're going to take the next step now. We're going to move NATO into Ukraine, and we're going to move it into Georgia. Go ahead and pull up your maps, see where these places are. This is completely unacceptable. Putin gives a speech at the Munich Security Conference that you can go watch, where it's kind of the first time he turns on the fiery opposition, basically saying, we should ask at this point, who is this expansion being directed against? I mean, you are moving way too close to us, and there winds up being a war as a result of this. Essentially, Georgia had, and again, not look on the map, Soviet Georgia, old Soviet Georgia between the Black and Caspian Seas there. They had an ongoing border dispute. And the thing about NATO is one of the things you can't have if you're going to join NATO is an existing border dispute. The idea is you don't want to let a state in that might, be in the midst of a civil war that could get very messy here. And so the president of Georgia at the time launched an invasion of these breakaway provinces, and in the process killed some Russian peacekeepers who were there. The Russians then invaded through this tunnel in the mountains, the Roki Tunnel, to fight the Georgian government, which they won. But the really shocking thing that you find at the time, if you read George W. Bush's memoirs, Decision Points, is Dick Cheney had said at the time that the United States should bomb the Russians, collapse the tunnel that the Russians were going through. And it's just really, really shocking stuff to read about. Um, and again, it was just seen as kind of a very sharp, again, 2007, 2008, all this is happening right there. The idea about Ukraine and Georgia joining NATO. And Ukraine was always seen as the brightest of red lines. And yeah, in 2014, obviously, when the government uh, uh, is is uh, is toppled uh, and Yanukovych flees the country, um, they vote to kick the Russians out of Sevastopol, out of their out of their naval base there, and the giving over of the Crimean Peninsula to Ukraine uh, was always a little bit controversial because it had essentially been Khrushchev, in order to firm up his power base in his move to become the leader following Stalin's death, to sort of shore up support there, he had transferred administration of that naval base in Crimea uh, to the Soviet Socialist Republic of Ukraine, but it hadn't mattered at the time because it was all directed from Moscow anyway, so it didn't matter. But then when independence came, it was a huge deal because it was the Russians' only real warm water port there. And so a lease had been negotiated, further leases had been negotiated, and that's when the Crimean Peninsula was seized. That was 2014. The eastern half of the country that was largely Orthodox and Russian speaking, didn't want to recognize the new government. They had largely voted for Yanukovych. Again, if you look at maps of the electoral results and you look at splits of linguistic and religious affiliation, it's really quite stunning because way back in the 90s when Huntington, Roskin references Huntington several times in your book, including in this chapter, Clash of Civilizations. He has a map in the book. I remember reading it, golly, like 2003, 2004, something like that. And he had Ukraine as a fault line. He had a line running right through Ukraine. And he said, this eastern half of the country here is Orthodox and Russian speaking. And the western half is, Ukrainian speaking and Uniate Christian. And he said, and this is a serious, likely fault line, uh, a point of conflict that may occur uh, between the West and Russia. And his prediction are present. Um, you know, so that's essentially why it happened. It was just a Russian red line. Um, the Russians were looking for a guarantee that Ukraine would not join NATO. They wanted it in writing. They wanted an actual treaty saying uh, that NATO would not advance anymore. So managing the neighbors, if you're Polish, if you're Latvian, if you're Lithuanian, you've been swallowed up by Russia many times. You want security guarantees. You want your security subsidized by someone larger and stronger than you. Otherwise, you may well be on the menu. So it's understandable why they want it. It's a question of whether or not it's to the benefit of the United States to do those types of things, but it's clear why they want it. And there's very fraught relations there, within those countries because there's a large Russian diaspora in those countries. Again, you one day, and Roskin talks about this in the book, is, when Putin intervenes in the civil war there to support the Russian-speaking Ukrainians in the East, he does so on the basis that, look, they're part of the Russian nation and that they need to be protected. Their rights need to be protected. And it's one of the reasons that the Baltic states have long, well, since independence, uh, been very cautious about their Russian population, is because you know, it's a complicated question. These were Soviet citizens. They were Russian speakers, and then one day the Soviet Union was gone, and they were in this new place. So, uh, you know, language rights and things like that are always very touchy in countries like that. Um, so managing relations with its neighbors is huge. Russia obviously has a very dominant relationship with relation to Belarus. Belarus even uses the Russian ruble. Um, Ukraine was just seen as if you listen to Putin's speech, he just said, look, you said you wouldn't put uh, you know, uh, dual use missile launchers in places like Romania and Poland, then you did it anyway. We don't like these missiles getting closer and closer to us. It reduces the amount of time that we have to react in the event of what we think is an attack. There's no way for us to accept this stuff being so close to us. And really, I mean, taking everything else out of the equation, I personally would like our leaders the world over to have as much time as possible to really mull something over. Whereas when you say, okay, you've got 7 minutes to decide, whether or not what we see on the screen might be a nuclear attack headed for Moscow. That's that's just not something that sounds good. We should, in my view, not do that. But that was what Putin believes was going to happen because there had been this idea that look, there won't be any troop presence in Eastern and Central Europe. There won't be any permanent military presence there. There won't be these dual-use missile launchers there. You know, it's so we're in a very bad state there. Trump recently said that he'd like to sit down with the Russians and negotiate some kind of drawdown, some kind of pullback, that the military spending is getting out of control on both sides, that there's tons of money being poured into new nuclear weapons, updating the nuclear weapons, creating new types, multiple reentry vehicles, hypersonic missiles. And it's just missile defenses, things of that nature. It would really be great if the United States and Russia, the two largest nuclear powers, could get back in some of these arms limitations treaties, get back in some of these missile limitation treaties that the George W. Bush administration ripped up, and then the first Trump administration ripped up. Um, they'd like China to get involved in those. China and Russia have a fairly close partnership and relationship at this point. It's questionable whether China would have any interest in this simply because China has far fewer nuclear weapons and materials than Russia or the United States. So that's why they've always been resistant to do something like that. But yeah, that's managing relations with the United States. As I said, managing relations with the neighbors. They raised no objection to Finland or Sweden joining NATO, which they did. Finland had long been neutral. Finlandization, this idea that they were going to be a neutral power, that they had the Soviet Union sort of had a veto over that they weren't allowed to join NATO. That was something that had kept them neutral during the Cold War. That was something that had been floated for Ukraine, ultimately turned down. Uh, but Putin again, Putin made no objection to them joining NATO, so it looks like possibly it was really just about Ukraine and Georgia, which are very critical to the approaches of Russia and to the Russian economic bloc potentially there. So in Georgia, there's gas pipelines that will be going through there. So um, that's the neighborhood. The neighborhood's very rough. You've got the North Koreans right down there. They butt up with the Japanese. There's some islands that run up on each other. Uh, there's a very long border with China. That was actually one of the reasons that they wanted to get out of the intermediate range ballistic missile treaty as well, was to position missiles along the border with China because your friend is your friend until they're not your friend. They have a long history of conflict there along their very long shared border. So it's a question whether or not that alliance, that agreement, that understanding will persist. Certainly, Henry Kissinger, Donald Trump had essentially in his first go round had said, "Look, I want to make friends with Russia." I talked with old Henry Kissinger. He said it was a great idea. I said we should be chums with Russia because that will help us to box in China, who's our real threat. Because Russia, the economy and demographic collapse, I mentioned the Russian population is just dying off. They're just dying off. They're never going to be the huge, dynamic, threatening economic force that something like China or India will be. And economically, uh, you know, uh, Obama probably was way too flippant when he said this, but he said, it's a gas station masquerading as a country. Uh, you know, there is a grain of truth to that, though. Like their economy is based on extracting raw material resources and exporting to them to the market, creating a positive balance of trade, and then using that money to subsidize, the standard of living of their citizens. This is not an economy that is going to be competing with the United States. This is far from it. There are certainly those entities within the United States, such as natural gas producers in Texas, who wanted the Germans to stop using Russian gas and oil and start buying it from them instead. But that's just kind of your basic you know uh, interest group lobbying in politics and whatnot. Economically, though, they were no threat to the United States' position of supremacy, nor were they going to be a problem for their neighbors. Uh, it's a point of revisionist history, counterfactual at this point, but you know, uh, I do think it's telling that they've been completely unable to conquer Ukraine, uh, which granted Ukraine has had, military supplies and money and stuff, but it's like they haven't actually encountered NATO forces yet. Like NATO is the largest military alliance and power block anywhere in the world, and the idea that was going to be able to Putin's Russia was going to be able to like in a conventional war fight the NATO bloc countries. It was just kind of ridiculous on its face. And then, you see the struggles that they're even having in Ukraine. I mean, I do think over the long term, Russia is going to grind them down. They just have more men, more material, and certainly probably more time on their side. Uh, that's one thing to understand is that when the invasion first happened, which I don't know, you were probably all in high school, maybe just entering college. I don't know how much of the papers you read and stuff, but the whole talk at the time in the corporate and government media here was, well, now Putin's done it. Now Putin has completely undermined his legitimacy. There's going to be huge protests in Russia. The war is going to be crazy unpopular. He's probably going to be overthrown. Didn't happen, right? The war was actually strongly supported. There were very minimal protests. Those people, a lot of them were just locked up. Um, which as a believer in freedom of speech and of assembly, obviously you oppose that. But right now we just have our analytical glass on and we look at it and we say, if the war really had been very unpopular, the regime would have been in huge trouble, but it just wasn't. The majority of Russians who cared thought that Putin was right, thought that the West was bullying Russia, was taking advantage of Russia, and was disrespecting them, uh, and that this was, just a reasonable reaction. Those who are even, politically politically active. I did find it kind of funny that he mentions in here that Russians seem to not be turning out for elections, some kind of like political apathy setting in. And it was right. Oh gosh, where was it? Mm, uh, let me see. Well, anyway, I did the math and actually it was about on par with our own turnout during that period. So um but uh yeah, there's again, if the war really was unpopular, they wouldn't be able to continue it as they have for many years with great sacrifice. Um, and so uh, there's this basis of Putin's regime, which is that it strengthened Russian society following the collapse and the chaos of the end of the Soviet Union, uh, of the chaos of the 1990s. And then, apart from the material standard of living, it was a matter of just bringing back Russian pride at being a major player on the world stage. You have to remember, Russia was one of the great powers. Russia is used to having its opinion count. Russia has been a great power for hundreds of years, a major player in world affairs. And even when the Soviet Union was in power, the USSR was then one of the two superpowers, right? So there's a great cult of Russian nationalism that you can just build on and feed on, and that is part of what Putin manifests and represent, and is part of his legitimacy. And at the bottom here, I put succession. Look, there's just no obvious successor to Putin. It would obviously be a little dangerous to keep a successor on hand. Um, when you are engaged in the kind of rule that he is. I think that's part of the reason that Xi Jinping has also so assiduously sidelined potential rivals over the course of his career over the last, 15 years as well. So, but it does create questions down the road. I mean, Putin is just an ordinary human being. Like if he had a heart attack in his sleep tonight, who would rule Russia tomorrow? This is something that since predictions about how the Russian people would react to the war against Ukraine were not fulfilled, there's been a little bit of a sobering up in the American commentariat. You even see people now openly say that Putin uh, is more of a moderating influence on sort of the worst, most irredentist uh, nationalists in Russian society. And if something were to happen to Putin, his successor would almost certainly be worse than he is. Um, because at this point, Putin is very secure. He has no need to do anything to, really further bolster his legitimacy. Whereas an incomer might, number one, just be more ideologically inclined toward conflict, towards, asserting Russian prerogatives in their former near abroad. They might also just feel more pressure to do so because Putin did uh wage the limited actions that he did in Georgia and in Syria, which I didn't talk about Syria, but in Syria and then in Ukraine. So they might feel pressure to do things like that to to build up their own legitimacy. And so apart from the fact that there's no clear successor, and there will obviously be a lot of horse trading, wheeling and dealing inside United Russia and inside those networks of clients that Putin has and the major power players there. But um, I don't like to make predictions about the future. As the saying goes, the trouble with making predictions about the future is sometimes they're wrong. So uh, Russia is of course not a liberal capitalist democracy, despite the outward trappings of it. Um, so just something to remember. Um, I'm trying to think if there was anything else that I wanted to say in closing about Russia. Um, I always try to conclude with some remarks more geared toward helping you understand where we are in the present moment and just trying to help you think about, because you'll hear about Russia in the news or something like that. Just remember what you've learned here about Russia's political system, about its political culture. Even if Putin was gone tomorrow, uh, it would be unlikely that things would change. Russia would not become a liberal capitalist democracy because there is no institutional or historical basis for it there. There's just no institutional memory, no social memory, nothing like that. Can't just you can't just grow those things magically. They're evolved things. And then, of course, on the world stage, Russia and China very close together. It's a partnership that makes sense on some levels. Russia being a major natural resources exporter, China being a large natural resources consumer. Russia doesn't produce a lot of its own manufactured goods. China does. So, but there's the possibility for them to become uh, too dependent on one another. There's also the issue of North Korea, which they both have ties to, and which they don't always agree on. And then there's the shared border and the historical animosity. So it's a question whether or not that will continue to exist into the future. Um, Again, I'm not going to hazard a guess as to whether or not it will, but and then Europe. JD Vance, the vice president, essentially just told the Europeans last week, hey, it's time for you guys to start taking care of your own security. The United States is done subsidizing you. You've made a mess of things. We're gonna make the deals that we need to make to end this silly war over Ukraine. And the Europeans were very outraged, etc. The ones at Brussels anyway. And or no, was it at Munich? I can't remember where they were. Sorry. And on one level, I understand what JD Vance is saying, right? War not going to be won, lots of money. You need to have a good relationship with Russia. Russia's not going anywhere. The United States doesn't really have anything at stake in that part of the world. Europe has not spent what it needs to on defense for many, many years. The U.S. taxpayer subsidizes it, etc. At the same time, though, I understand the outrage of the European establishment because they had opposed the plan to bring Ukraine into NATO. which is ostensibly what the war was primarily about. The French and Germans had tried very hard not to let George W. Bush try and bring Ukraine to NATO. They had then, once conflict broke out in 2014, they had brokered not one, but two different agreements to try and stop the fighting and freeze the conflict, which the Obama administration refused to back, instead backing the Ukrainian nationalists. So, and now the war having erupted, right? To turn Roskin's phrase around here, uh, certainly the Russians started it, but the Americans provoked it. Um, the Europeans are saying, "What are you talking about? You just want to leave us hanging onto this bag here? We were following your lead the whole time." So there have been some announcements of increased defense spending recently. It'll be interesting to see whether or not those actually pan out because those happen not frequently in Europe, but they do happen, and then they get scaled back. So we'll see. The UK just announced one. There's talk now that maybe there will be British and French peacekeeping forces deployed to Ukraine as part of a deal. Um, it'll be interesting to see what happens there. Obviously, Russia has a huge stake in what happens in Ukraine. They've sacrificed far too much not to get what they want at this point, and you know, so there's not a lot of leverage there, um, as far as the Western negotiating position goes. But um, yeah, certainly this has very badly damaged relations between the West and Russia, between the United States and Russia, um, between Europe and Russia. Uh, so some states were just not going to have a phenomenal relationship with Russia. The Baltic states probably weren't going to have a great relationship with Russia. Poland probably wasn't going to have a great relationship with Russia. But Germany, it was there was no reason that the Germans couldn't have a good relationship with Russia. The AfD, who we said the election, we were going to watch the elections. Well, the AfD won 20% of the vote. They dominated in Eastern Germany, just like we knew they would. And they're a party who says, look, we should get along better with Russia. They're going to be excluded from government, which means that the CDU, who won, is going to be forced to govern with the SPD and the Greens and the left, and so things are just going to continue to get worse for Germany. We'll see whether or not the AfD continue to build momentum and continue to gain adherence as the CDU just refuses to see the light and stop parroting and the parroting the policies of the left. They have to. They have no choice. You all remember how coalition government works. But the German economy ran on cheap Russian gas. So it made it an exporting machine in part in the 80s, 90s, and 2000s. So German economy's been in recession for 3 years now. But Nord Stream, was blown up allegedly by the Ukrainians, for what that's worth. But so of course the pipeline could get rebuilt. Is that something that's going to happen? I don't know. Don't know. Uh, Certainly there could have been a better future uh, for Europe. The goal in the 1990s was a Europe whole and undivided, but that's not what happened. So, will Russia, is Russia European, like Catherine the Great insisted? I don't know. Certainly, Putin, when he came to power, was very Western looking, asked to join NATO, was rebuffed, and spent many years trying to cultivate good relations, certainly with the George W. Bush administration, but ultimately things did not work out that way. And I think he has staunchly closed the door on that. And certainly Russian political culture has very much among the elite embraced a kind of a Eurasianist perspective that Russia is different, that it will have a different path. And so that's Russia. I hope you all have a wonderful spring break. Again, congratulations to our ladies. Best of luck in any future games that you may have over the next, I believe, week and a half is when it finishes up. So at the Crossroads tournament. So have a wonderful spring break. When we return, we are going to India. So I look forward to seeing you then. Thanks so much. Have a great spring break.